Okay, here's your suggested answer for the question: ministers remain central to the policy-making process. Analyse and evaluate this statement. The way I'll do that is using the usual model. I'll look at an introduction, I'll then do 3 key points, arguing for and against, and then suggest the conclusion. Okay, let's start with the introduction. Let's start with the definition of terms. We know that there is a convention of individual ministerial responsibility, which holds that the minister is accountable for the actions of the department, therefore central to the policy-making process. That's reinforced by Thiegson's formal constitutional model, which suggests that the minister should be responsible as the elected representative in government. However, this must be considered in the light of the growing complexity of government decision-making, and also factors such as the more activist prime ministers who want to influence different departments. So our first point is that the ministers remain constitutionally central to the policy-making process. Thiegson supports this, as we've said, by the formal constitutional model, saying that civil servants are subservient to the minister as the elected member of government. And this has been taken seriously by many ministers in the past. We can look back at the resignations of Dugdale over Crystal Down, Carrington over Falklands, Estelle Morris over issues to do with education policy. And we can also argue that strong ministers have been able to impose their own direction on government departments, such as Brown and Blunkett, and more recently Gove. To argue against this is to talk about the political reality that, in fact, ministers are rarely in total control of the policy of the department. Some have suggested that the civil servants has been obstructive, too conservative perhaps, in blocking significant change. Thiegson's adversarial model underpins this, saying that the civil servants benefit from their expertise and they control the advice and direction of policy against inexperienced ministers who sometimes even actually have to adopt the policies of previous ministers or governments. So, you may want to evaluate that the real power of ministers is determining the direction of policy in the department relies heavily on the capacity to control the civil service with a clear vision. The second point is to say that the minister is still centrally in control because they've enhanced their political capacity to control policy. How has this been the case? Well, you can argue about the growth in special advisors used by ministers. Good examples of this may include Ed Balls in the Treasury with Gordon Brown, Dominic Cummings in Education with Gove. Shaping the agenda of the department using special advisors has been pretty significant, and this can regulate the influence the civil service have in the implementation of policy. However, to talk about this enhanced political strength is to ignore a number of political threats that they face. The emergence of activist prime ministers and the threat of dismissal from the cabinet still hangs over a minister. You may also say that ministers have to be aware of their own backbenchers and may seek to have to bring U-turns into place because of constituents' concerns. Examples of this may include Javid removal by Johnson as Chancellor because he wanted to ensure that he had someone on the same page as him within the Treasury. Or perhaps looking at contentious issues such as high-speed railway or NHS pay may force ministers to U-turn on policy decisions. So we're now talking about political power and the reality of how much political power can control policy. The evaluation might be that the minister can determine policy, but it depends on the relationships within the department, with the Prime Minister and with their backbenchers. Our final point is to talk about how ministers can remain the central decision-making focus in Westminster. The reality is the minister is in charge of the department and naturally will be the focus of decision-making, both through parliamentary scrutiny, in terms of questions and select committees, and media attention. The principle of parliamentary sovereignty means that policy will be made by the minister and have a national impact. We contrast that with the constitutional forms and international obligations that over time have made decision-making much more diverse and perhaps more constrained as a result. Devolution has led to the fragmentation of policy, certainly in key areas such as agricultural health and education. The passing of the Human Rights Act, the emergence of the Supreme Court has placed great constraints on the ministers too. So when we're talking about whether or not they are the central decision-making person, the fragmentation of policy making and the range of influence that the minister now has can never mean they can never truly dictate the full extent of any policy decision. So let's get to our conclusions. What's the judgment? Well, you're going to have to decide whether or not the minister is still central to policy making. If you're arguing in favour of this, you must acknowledge that there are some significant limitations on the autonomy of a minister in modern times. But you'll probably stress that the minister remains the key elected decision maker constitutionally in the government and has the capacity to steer a path through these various influences that they face. If you're challenging this, you'd have to acknowledge that the minister is that constitutional position. However, the traditional position of the minister has been undermined through the fragmentation of the policy process, meaning really the constitutional position doesn't really reflect reality. Okay, good luck.